Greetings everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on Kingship and Masculinity. Myself Shruti Vip, a faculty from Department of History, PGDAV Evening College, University of Delhi. In today's lecture, we would be talking about the position of women and specifically the gender perspective vis-a-vis the polity. Till now, we have discussed several aspects related to gender in early India, like art, architecture, the textual tradition. In today's lecture, we would be talking about the hegemonic discourse that is clearly visible in several sources with regards to the political conditions and with regards to the political power of women. Discrimination based on gender, homosexuality, caste, color and class could make the notions of masculinity more complex as well as hegemonic. So, hegemonic masculinities are constructed specifically in relation to women. When we are talking about any kind of hegemony, one needs to outline the importance of the term hegemony with reference to cultural dynamic. So, the concept of hegemony deriving from Gramsci's analysis of class relations becomes very relevant here, and it also refers to the cultural dynamic by which a particular group claims, sustains and also reinforces a leading position in socio-political and cultural life. With this, we can also understand the concept of social reproduction of inequality that was very well explained by Bourdieu. It revolves around the question of how particular groups of people, especially men, inhabit positions of power, they acquired wealth, power, and how they attempted to legitimate and reproduce, reinforce the social relationships that generated their dominance time and again, and how this tendency had a clear-cut influence on the gender relations both in the past as well as in the contemporary societies. Today's lecture would basically cover the period from 1500 BCE to 700 BCE, and this chronological span would deal with the Sanskrit and Brahmanical texts, both normative as well as narrative. So, this would also incorporate some reference to the Buddhist and the Jaina sources as well as several epigraphical evidences. The earliest text, Rig Samhita, and then some later Vedic texts like Aitreya Brahmana, Taittiriya Samhita and Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, they roughly cover a span from 1500 BCE to 6th century BCE, and they contain several allusions to varied aspects of masculinities that were supposed to exist in a king's personality, and how these various allusions ultimately kept the queens away from enjoying political power and dominance. Now, as there was a transition from a tribal to a state society from the Rig Vedic period to the later Vedic period and then the post Vedic period, gradually there was emergence of state societies when kingship emerged as an institution, and henceforth this kind of binary and existence of masculinity in the personality of king and the whole concept of kingship became more and more prominent as well as contextualized. This institution underwent several changes and the changing component of masculinity was also influenced by the changing socio-political, economic and cultural milieu. So, as a result, caste and subcaste or jati frameworks also came to exercise an influence in determining the structures of masculinity in early India, and again the trend continued in the medieval as well as contemporary times. So, there were varied prescriptive texts, especially from the post-Vedic period onwards. One can talk of several Dharma Sutras of Apastambha, Vasishtha, Gautama, Bodhayan. They kind of provide some kind of a prescriptive view on the sexuality and strength of a king. So, there were a series of folklore traditions and epic traditions that mention different views on masculinity of kings, which can be traced again to the Vedic, later Vedic and post-Vedic times onwards. As a result, the kind of masculinity that was projected in the ancient texts came to be looked upon as the ideal. So, therefore, in several epic traditions, there was a concept of a masculine king, and the references occur in both the descriptive as well as the normative chapters. For example, the Shanti Parv of Mahabharata specifically deals with this aspect. Then another textual source that one can mention is the Arth Shastra, a text of the Mauryan as well as post-Mauryan times, which again constitutes and can be considered as an effective source that deals with the concepts of kingship, statecraft, as well as masculinity. So, various allusions to the origin of kingship with a clear-cut masculine dimension were added, and they can also be traced to several Puranas like the Vishnu Puran, the Matsya Puran, dated around 4th century CE. So, there were a number of legal digests also which began reflecting the perspective of the state on various issues. So, as a result, the Dharma Shastra literature like the Manusmriti, the Yajnavalkya, Brihaspati, Narad Smritis, they all provide us with a clear-cut normative discourse on masculinity of kingship. And in addition to this, one can also talk about the literature, the plays of Kalidasa, and how kingship was viewed and accepted within the society, and this is clearly visible in several plays written by Kalidasa, which kind of capture life in an emperor's court, where there was different language ascribed to royalty, that was Sanskrit, and the language of the masses, which was Prakrit. Now, in addition to these textual sources, one should also consider the epigraphic sources, and several epigraphic sources starting from the Mauryan king Ashoka's period have largely created a kind of narrative, and the same narrative related to kingship and royalty was also visible in several Buddhist sources that have also mentioned Ashoka's period. So, the epigraphic material throws valuable light on the practical dimensions of kingship, especially several rock and pillar edicts of Ashoka can fall in this category. Now, one particular aspect that was reinforced time and again regarding who is an ideal king was an emphasis on physical fitness, sexual potency and fertility of an individual to become the king, to become the legitimate ruler, to become a complete man. And this kind of narrative runs throughout the textual tradition. And the earliest text, Rig Samhita, has numerous terms to describe the masculinity of gods like Indra, Agni, Dayus and Soma. and there was a specific metaphor that was used to describe this kind of potency and this kind of strength, and that was the metaphor of bull. So bull stood as a metaphor of masculinity, and because of specific physiography and natural traits of a bull, which could become comparable to those that should be possessed by a man, a human being, or a god. So both Indra and Agni, the two most powerful and popular gods of the Vedic pantheon, were either compared with the bull or were called the Vrishab or the bull. In this background, one can now move on to understand as to what was considered the prime duty of the king. The prime duty of a king was not only to rule the kingdom, but it was also to provide heir. A king had to give his empire or people a legitimate ruler to rule. So the Shatapatha Brahmana mentions that he alone is a king who propagates offspring. So a king who was not able to provide an offspring was not legitimate enough a ruler. And even Mahabharata, the entire narrative is it begins from the story of Satyavati, that how the absence of offspring kind of forced Satyavati on the demise of her son to resort to the practice of niyoga, by which her other son Vedvyasa was made to cohabit with his daughters-in-law in order to provide heirs to the Bharata lineage. So the practice of niyoga was one of the last resorts that was always available to royalty, and it was not just in this epic tradition that such a concern existed. Even the Jataka Kathas speak of an impotent king who was forced to resort to the practice of niyoga in order to provide an offspring and in order to provide a legitimate ruler to the kingdom. So one such example can be that of Suruchi Jataka, and it is a kind of ambiguous that how this Suruchi Jataka puts the entire blame of childlessness on the queen's fate. And in Suruchi Jataka, the practice was to be resorted to in dire circumstances. This is what is mentioned in this Jataka story. And when the king's numerous wives failed to reproduce and the king's impotence was kind of visible, then there was no option, and the chief queen and the other wives had to accept it as their fate. And only towards the end of the story, the system of niyoga or the practice of niyoga was resorted to in the name of public good. And when the subjects of the king demanded that the lineage of the ruler had to be perpetuated, and so this was achieved through the practice of niyog. Now, the mechanism of niyog was also an attempt to heal the king's breached masculinity, and there was definitely an assertion of male sexuality, and this definitely indicated a growing patriarchal structure which was not only limited to the social norms, but it was also now predominant system that was prevalent in the polity as well. Now, it is in this background that let us now discuss politics and women in early India. In politics, a woman's role was limited to being the wife of the ruling king or the mother of a successful ruler. So, there are several textual traditions which speak about masculinity. They give detailed account of kingdoms and several rulers, but very few refer to women in the political sphere. This indicates that her role was marginalized, and women as rulers or as influential beings in the politics or in the kingdom was hardly discussed. So, the issue of gender identity can be seen in terms of representation of women and men in a variety of fields, whether it was economic, social, religious, cultural, political. And it was in this context that several ways in which both women and men were represented or they themselves represent acquires significance. We have already discussed with reference to sculptures, with reference to art, and with reference to several architectural traditions. In order to study regional social formations, understanding these gender relations is very important. Gender identity can be perceived in historical terms as well, in ways by understanding or exploring ways in which identities of men and women were constructed in particular regions or in society at large. So, the concept of household or the role that women played in a household becomes important. So, women's identity was considered to be fixated and it was largely understood in terms of her gendered identity, which was defined specifically by her sexuality as well as her reproductive capacity, her reproductive role. And several studies of women have generally been restricted to the family as a wife or a mother or a daughter, and they have generally remained confined to the household. The same has been true for royalty and for powerful kingdoms. So, women were perceived as a passive social category in most of the textual as well as inscriptional sources, and her contribution to society was largely relegated to the background, and her role was seen specifically with regard to child rearing and bearing roles. As has been pointed out by K.K. Shah, it is important to understand this transition from a monolithic category of women or specifically elite women as to how they were grouped into a different kind of a framework. And in this there is a specific mention of the term royal women by K.K. Shah. The emphasis in this kind of a study has been on the donative capability and donative capacity of women in different regions, which largely indicates their control over their own resources or their influence over the resources of the kingdom. So, a question that has been raised is how far royal women capable of claiming a position similar to that of the king, and whether the construction of gender identity through the formalized structure of kingship could have been possible in such a framework. And another very pertinent question is that how far could queens claim power and to what extent they succeeded in this endeavor. Now, in order to understand all these issues, one again needs to go back to the issue of kingship and kinship. So, a question that becomes relevant for the present study or exploration is as to how rulers in early India claimed power. What were the several important benchmarkers, and were even queens had access to such benchmarkers or not? And in historical terms, a king clearly claimed power by identifying himself as the legitimate ruler through kinship ties. So, the important deciding factor was of course ancestorship. It was the kinship, that is the family ties, the blood ties, and all these were the factors that ultimately had an influence on the institution of kingship. And kingship could become legitimate only through this particular factor. Of course, military proficiency and a strong army were also very important. So, it is with these several kind of divergent views and explanations that we now move on to one of the example that has been quoted of a queen or a regent queen, to be specific, named Prabhavati Gupta. There were very few women rulers in Indian history, and in early India, the overall system that was prevalent was that of loose political structures, and the possibility of women rulers was definitely there in such loose political structures. For example, in regions like Deccan as well as in Kashmir. In the Vakataka kingdom also, there has been a mention of a queen, Prabhavati Gupta, who ruled as a regent. Now, how Prabhavati Gupta claimed her position as a ruler and how she was able to identify herself, what were the different kind of markers of identity that she used, and how could these be compared to the kings of Vakataka dynasty. So, all this can give us a clearer understanding of the gendered notion of kingship. A very interesting explanation has been given by Cynthia Talbot with regards to this kind of an explanation, where women rulers in Andhra, which was again a loose political structure and kinship ties, they played a very important role in such kind of regions, and women had a greater access to political power in such regions where there was a loose political structure. Cynthia Talbot has also pointed out that a regent was a preferred system rather than woman herself becoming a ruler or declaring herself to be a ruler, because as a regent a woman would still be accepted, while as a ruler herself, then there was all probability that the males would refuse to accept her rule. Now, having discussed various aspects related to polity, specifically with reference to gendered identity, I hope you have gained some information. Rest of the important discussion points would be covered in the succeeding lecture. Thank you.